You're not going to be able to control what other people do. So even if you take the utmost care in your manuscript to make sure that you are not defaming anyone, you cannot control how they're going to view your work and what action they're going to take in response to your work. Okay. So you can be as prudent and careful and reasonable as possible and still have a claim made against you. All right. So that's something to be aware of. But if you are prudent and you do take care, then you're going to have a good defense to their claim.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indie Author Podcast, I talk with attorney Kathryn Goldman about navigating legal risk in memoir, including the delicate balance memoir writers must strike to avoid defamation, invasion of privacy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Kathryn explains the legal definitions and elements of these terms and offers advice on minimizing risk, emphasizing the importance of accuracy and distinguishing between statements of fact and opinion. We also discuss the complexities of protecting oneself when writing about identifiable real-life figures, and what authors must consider when deciding whether to fictionalize elements of their stories. And now let's hear from Kathryn Goldman about navigating legal risk in memoir. Hello, and welcome to the Indie Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Kathryn Goldman. Hey, Kathryn, how are you doing?
I'm fine, Matty. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. And to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Kathryn Goldman is an intellectual property attorney who focuses her practice on the protection and enforcement of copyright and trademark rights for businesses and individuals. She represents creative professionals, writers, artists, photographers, and innovative entrepreneurs. Leaving 30 years of litigation behind her, Kathryn now focuses her work on keeping creatives out of court so they can create more work. And Kathryn is also the legal advisor of the Alliance of Independent Authors, which is how I met her. And I invited Kathryn on the podcast to talk about how to minimize your risk when writing memoir. And Kathryn, you had sent me this note in preparation for a conversation, which I liked a lot. Memoir can involve a delicate walk through the minefields of defamation, invasion of privacy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. And we'll talk about how to navigate those treacherous areas of law so a writer can tell their truth and still protect themselves. And so one question I had for you is, to what extent will the information you share be generalizable to nonfiction beyond memoir, or is it quite specific to memoir?
Oh, can be generalized to nonfiction broadly. So all of these areas will apply to any type of nonfiction writing. And it will also apply to fiction to the extent, like historical fiction, to the extent you are incorporating real individuals and real events in your story. These areas of law will also apply in those circumstances.
Perfect. Okay. Well, I thought a good way to start out would be that I think I understand what some of those terms we used mean: defamation, invasion of privacy, intentional infliction of emotional distress. But I know sometimes the legal definitions of these terms can be a little bit different or more nuanced than, sort of a general understanding of them. So can you just talk a little bit about what, for example, defamation means?
Okay. So there are two kinds of defamation. There's defamation in writing, and there's spoken defamation. So spoken defamation is slander. So we're not going to be talking about slander because we're talking about written work, which is libel. Okay. So the elements of defamation is a false statement of fact about another person that you say to a third party, not to that person. And there has to be some element of fault. You knew it was false, or you didn't check out whether it was true before you spread it around. So on the part of the person who writes the fact or publishes the fact, there has to be some kind of fault. And there also has to be the person about whom the defamation is made. There has to be some kind of damage to that person, damage to reputation, lost business. Sometimes the defamation can be so bad that people become physically ill. So there has to be some kind of damage. And so those are what are called the elements of defamation. And you have to have all four of those before a claim can be made for defamation. So that's defamation. Do you want to take them one at a time? How do you want to do this?
Yeah. How about invasion of privacy? That was one of the other things we wanted to talk about.
Okay. So invasion of privacy, right? So think about it as intrusion upon seclusion, right? So you are in your private space. You're in your bedroom, which happens a lot in Memoir. You are in a private space and you have an expectation of privacy, and somebody, a peeping Tom, or somebody who comes in at your invitation knowing that this is a private space, right? And so, but then they share it with the rest of the world. That's an invasion of privacy. And the rest of the world doesn't have any reason to know or any right to know these things. That's going to be an invasion of privacy. There are other kinds of invasion of privacy. There's, appropriating somebody's name or likeness. We see a lot of that in the college sports arena right now. NIL, that name, image, and likeness. That is a form of invasion of privacy. And then there's false light invasion of privacy. When you depict someone in a scenario that casts them in a false light. Like if you put somebody in the middle of a bar brawl and suggest that they either started it or were involved in it, and they weren't. So that's false light. So these are all different types of invasion of privacy.
And then the last term we mentioned was intentional infliction of emotional distress.
Right. So intentional infliction of emotional distress is when you engage in conduct intentionally, right? Trying to cause somebody to become upset. And your conduct has to be extreme. It has to be outrageous conduct. And the conduct has to be what causes the distress. And the distress has to be severe. And sometimes some applications of the law require a physical manifestation of distress. So intentional infliction of emotional distress would be something like if you are intentionally lying about somebody in order to cause them distress, that can be defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Now, one thing I want to point out about all of these laws is that these are state-based laws. So each claim is going to be slightly different in every state or in every country. And there are going to be some states or countries that don't recognize these causes of action. Intentional infliction of emotional distress is not recognized in every state or in every country. So you really have to check your local laws and check with a local attorney to determine whether it is going to apply in your situation.
Perfect. So let's start out because we'd originally talked about memoir, and that's kind of an obvious one where most people, unless you're writing a memoir about your time on a desert island, they're going to be writing about interactions with other people. And I think that memoirists are often pulled in these two directions, of the authenticity of the experience, but also being sensitive to all these considerations that you just mentioned. So how do you advise memoir writers to avoid those defamation claims, for example? Let's focus on that when they're sharing stories about real people.
So the first thing you have to understand is that you're not going to be able to control what other people do. So even if you take the utmost care in your manuscript to make sure that you are not defaming anyone, you cannot control how they're going to view your work and what action they're going to take in response to your work, okay? So you can be as prudent and careful and reasonable as possible and still have a claim made against you, all right? So that's something to be aware of. But if you are prudent and you do take care, then you're going to have a good defense to their claim. Okay, so having said that, when you are concerned about defamation, about defaming somebody, remember that the very first element of defamation is it must be a false statement of fact. Okay? So if you are speaking the truth, and it is a provable truth, it won't be defamation. Okay? It's an objectively provable truth, will not be defamation. And the other thing that you can do is you can couch your characterization of the situation, of the person, of the event or circumstances as an opinion, right? Because if you are expressing an opinion, you are not stating a fact. So if you were to write a scene, and memoir is often in first person, and you write a scene and you say, it appeared to me as though, she burned down that house on purpose, right? It appears to me as though, or when I look at that, it makes me think of simile, metaphor, whatever. So you are casting the event as your opinion and not as a fact. And when you do that, you are building a defense to defamation. So you have the defenses to defamation are truth on the one hand, objective truth, and opinion on the other hand. So those are two solid ways to prevent a claim of defamation against you. Now, having said that, there's also, right at the get-go, there's also the notion of fictionalizing the person, right? Not identifying the person, changing, you could change the town in which the events happen. You change the setting in which the events happen. You can change the description of the person, give them a different occupation. You can change it entirely. You can still tell your story and how that person made you feel and how that person impacted your life without identifying that person. So that's a decision that you make at the beginning before you even, put pen to paper.
Yeah, it seems as if so I've spoken to a number of memoirists on my What I Learned video series, and several of them have said that they are clear with their readers that they're not reproducing interactions with particular people. So, for example, they sometimes conglomerate people. Maybe they had two bad bosses and they want to tell a story about dealing with a bad boss. So they kind of conglomerate those two bad bosses into one, and there's no expectation. The reader knows that they shouldn't expect that they're ever going to find, that named bad boss in LinkedIn or something like that. And it does seem really tricky. What I was thinking of when you were talking is the scenario where this maybe isn't memoir so much as like creative nonfiction, where somebody's telling a story about a celebrity figure or a historical figure or something like that, where they're putting words in that character's mouth. Like I'm thinking of The Crown. The Crown was sort of generally following factual stories about Queen Elizabeth and her family, but obviously taking great liberties with the behind the scenes action, the dialogue, and so on. So that was more sort of expose-ish almost. Are there different approaches to those two desired ends?
Yeah, I think that, when you're doing something, when you're writing something like The Crown, there has to be a pretty heavy legal vetting of the manuscript, of the script. And, that would be, you would apply UK law. So you'd have to take a look at what the law is in the UK with respect to defamation. Those are famous individuals. The law in the United States is different for famous individuals than it is for private individuals, right? So it's more difficult to defame a famous person than it is to defame a private person. So you have to take a look at what the law is. You have to do an analysis of the manuscript, and you're going to have to go through to see what could potentially sustain a claim. But it's not going to be really different between memoir and, historical fiction or creative nonfiction. All of the elements are going to be the same. The legal elements and how they apply to what's in the manuscript, that analysis is going to be the same for both once you can pin down the law that applies.
If someone is writing not about celebrities, but just about people in their own lives, and let's say they come to you and they're trying to make that decision about, do I name names or do I fictionalize names or places or identifiable characteristics? Are there any criteria that you say, well, if this, then you should probably keep the name the same. If this, then you should, consider fictionalizing it?
So you gave the example of, the bad boss. Okay. So the bad boss is really easy to fictionalize because you can change the company, you can change the job description, very easy to fictionalize. But if you're writing about your family and you're writing about your abusive stepfather and you want to use your own name as the author, that person's going to be identifiable, right? You can't fictionalize that. So then you have the question of, all right, do I write under a pseudonym? Okay. So if you really, are worried that your abusive stepfather is going to sue you and you write under a pseudonym, then are you in a position to ever even talk about your book? And so when you're writing memoir and you're writing about what has happened to you, you really have to focus on why you're writing that memoir. And there are a lot of reasons for writing a memoir. And with the memoirs that I have worked with, and I do have on my website, I'm going to plug it here, creativelawcenter.com, I have a replay of a workshop I did on this very topic, interviewing 2 memoirists who talked about whether they were going to identify themselves and thereby identify all the family members, or whether they were going to use a pseudonym and the decision tree that comes with that decision. So if you use a pseudonym and you are writing a memoir because you want to share your story with others who are in a similar situation, and you want to be able to talk about that freely, you really can't use a pseudonym, right? So there are some situations in which you cannot fictionalize. And so there are these decisions that you have to make at the very beginning and what risk you're willing to take based on those decisions. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it made me think of another question, which is that let's say someone is writing this because they want to, they're writing about an abusive situation, and then they want to follow this book up with public appearances where they talk about their experience in order to support other people who have faced that same situation. Okay. So is there a legal difference between, if someone dug, they could find out who that person's stepfather was or whoever the bad actors in the story were, but they never mention the names in the book or in their talks? Or is the very fact that that person is discoverable, could that lead to legal issues?
The fact that the person is identifiable in the book can lead to legal issues. So then you have to weigh the question of whether that person who has not been identified by name, but only by description and relationship to the author, whether that person wants to out him or herself by making a claim, by filing a lawsuit, which is public, a public record, which everybody has access to, by saying, I am the stepfather who has been accused. Of course, this is all, a scenario, right? I am the stepfather who has been accused of this abuse, and I didn't do it. Okay. Now, so what happens when these claims are made is that oftentimes it sheds more light on the situation than would have been shed had they just stayed quiet. It draws more attention to the book. it drives sales of the book, quite frankly, when a claim is filed. So you have to decide, is that person going to make a claim when they haven't been openly identified in the book? And that's going to, depend on what you know about this person, their risk tolerance for exposure, your risk tolerance for having a claim made. So all of these things go into the calculus of how you approach the memoir in that situation.
It does seem like so much of this is driven by what the underlying impetus for writing the book is. And so, 90% of the time when I'm talking to writers about why they wrote a book, it's because they had a fictional story they just had to tell, or they had an experience in their own life that they wanted to share. They had some advice that they thought would help people. It's all sort of like positive motivation, I guess. But with this scenario, you do introduce this sort of less admirable possible motivation, which is, I want to pay it back to someone. And so it's almost like you can't apply the normal rules of the writing and publishing world if what's driving a writer is a desired payback. It's just hard to even know how to talk about that in the writing world.
That's very interesting. Revenge. I've worked with a lot of memoirists. I've reviewed a lot of manuscripts to clear for these exact issues. And I can safely say that not one of them had revenge as a motive that they shared with me. Mostly it's, I want to expose this unjust situation so that other people who find themselves in this situation know they're not alone. I want to share the mistakes I made so other people don't make the same mistakes. Those have been the motivations. Revenge has not been one that I have dealt with, but it certainly is out there, which kind of leads to another reason a lot of people write memoir, and that's for personal therapy, right? And so not always should a memoir be published, right? Sometimes if that's the reason the author is writing the memoir, maybe it's okay to keep it private. The other thing to keep in mind about memoir, and again, one of these, foundational pieces, is that memoirs of happy lives are not that interesting, right? The memoirs that are interesting are the ones where something tragic has happened. Something has happened that has changed this person from person A to person B after going through the event. And the event is usually some kind of crisis, some kind of tragedy. Happiness throughout your life does not make for much of a transformation. Something has to have happened. So that's when all of these things come into play. I was thinking of an exception, and one of those exceptions is the story of sickness and recovery, right? So yes, something tragic has happened, but it was not forced on them by another person necessarily. So that can be an interesting memoir to read without there being exposure to potential claims by evil deed doers.
Yeah, I've spoken to several memoirists who have said exactly that it was the initial drafting was the therapeutic effort, that they had something they wanted to get off their chest, get out of their heart, get it onto the paper, sort of purge themselves of it. And then they sort of set that aside. And then they said, okay, now I want to write something shareable, and the final product looked quite different. For example, they may have written their whole experience out as it occurred to them chronologically, but it wasn't an interesting way to present it to a reader. And so they were, shortening up timeframes in area. They were cutting out boring periods. They were focusing intensively on maybe one key hour could take up more of their memoir than, the following uneventful years. And so I do like that idea of separating out the writing you're doing privately and the writing you're doing publicly. And among all the other craft considerations you'd want to bring to an update of that, of moving it from the private to the public material, factoring in the legal considerations as well.
Right. And then when you're doing that, the question becomes, do you fictionalize it completely?
Yeah.
I mean, because with the crux of the story, the theme of the story, the event, the transformation can be true to your experience, and the characters, the place, the setting, everything can be completely different, and you can still tell the story. And once you do that, then you really are minimizing the risk involved.
Yeah.
So, it goes back to, what is your why? Why are you doing it?
Yeah. Well, that whole question of truth versus embellishment, if it's completely fictionalized, if you move it into a fictional presentation, then that kind of takes care of that. But if you decide you want to present it as a memoir, and let's say that you grew up in a small town, and the small town is a very important part of what the experience was, and you want to name it, and so people are going to be able to guess or know who the individuals that you're talking about are.
Uh-huh.
So since memoir often involves that level of creative embellishment, how do you balance the creative storytelling with the legal obligations to ensure that you don't cross the line into misrepresentation?
Well, if you're going to name the small town and you're going to put the people in the small town, the real people in the small town, you better stick to objective truths, right? Objective truths, or couch it as opinion, right? That's how you're going to have to tell that story. I mean, and then, you've got this whole issue of, you're going to have the whole town in an uproar, and you have to kind of think about how that's going to reflect on you and how that's going to change your life going forward, which is not a legal question.
Yeah.
Having a lawsuit filed against you is going to impact your life going forward, because I can tell you that, lawsuits are no fun. So you really have to decide whether this is something that you want to go through and experience. And is it really important to identify that small town? Again, I'm going to point you to that interview I did of the two memoirists who talked very openly about why they chose, what they chose in terms of writing. One of them went so far as to assist in the sponsorship of legislation in his home state. He was the subject of abuse as a child, and he had a whole law passed to address the situation. So that's a big why, what are we setting out to do? So I think that you have to think about what part of your life you're going to donate to this memoir going forward, even after it's published.
Yeah, I like the idea of framing it up that way. And it also sort of suggests another consideration, which is we talked about intentional infliction of emotional distress, but then I think people also have to think about unintentional infliction of emotional distress. And they might put something in their book that they don't imagine is going to be upsetting for somebody to read, and then it proves to be. Do you have any advice about how people can assess or avoid unintentional infliction of emotional distress?
So that's really interesting, because that's something else that, along the lines of, you can't control or anticipate how somebody's going to react and whether they'll file a claim. You also can't control how they're going to react when they read something that they identify with themselves in your manuscript or in your book. And I have had so many authors come to me saying, well, nothing I said is bad. Everybody's in a really good light, in my story. I can't imagine. Well, that's right. You can't imagine, because you're not the person reading it, and you don't know what their circumstances are. And so you don't know. And that's unintentional. And that gets into, you can't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
Right? So that's less likely to form the basis of a legal claim than it is to form the basis of, a damaged relationship in the future.
It reminds me of back when I was in the corporate world, and I would get, requests from fellow employees to provide input to their performance appraisals. And sometimes I would write it up, and when I was done, like it might have been someone I loved working with. They had done me a huge favor. They had helped move a project along or whatever it might be. And if I were describing those specifics, I would usually send it to the person first and say, is there anything in here that you don't want me to say? So for example, I was working with someone who was in sort of the kind of like a compliance area of the company. And can you tell I'm disguising the name, protect the innocent. And he had, I won't say circumvented the intent of the compliance responsibility he had, but he was going out of his way to help me move something along in a way that we both felt was compliant with the spirit of the law. And so I had tried to write that up in a way that I thought would be appropriate to share with his boss, but I sent it to him first and I said, am I saying anything you don't want to hear? You don't want your boss to hear. And he said, no, that all sounds fine. But I can kind of imagine the same thing, that looping back with the actual people and saying, hey, here's a chapter I wrote about an interaction we had, and show it to them, not necessarily promising to make changes based on what they say, but promising to hear what they say. What are your thoughts about that based on the work you've done with memoirists?
I don't like it at all.
Really?
I do not like sending portions of a manuscript to a third party for review. You're suggesting, even though you say, I'm not going to promise to make any changes, well, then why are you sending it, right? Mm-hmm. And then if you don't say that, are you giving them editorial control over your manuscript? I don't like it as a general rule. I have had cases where the author has sent a request for permission to use, in this case, I think it was a seminary, right? And he had spent some time in a seminary and he wanted to use the setting to tell his fictional story in a real setting. And whoever was, the boss at seminary gave him that permission because based on the personal relationship, he got permission. That's great. But he also asked after the book was written, what are you going to rewrite your whole book when they say no? So that's one example. Another example I had recently was somebody who wrote a work of fiction based on her own experiences and included a character who had personality traits similar to someone she knew 25 years ago. And she sent that off to the person saying, this is not you, but, here's what I'm writing. And that person was extraordinarily unhappy, contacted the publisher, contacted the author's spouse. It was not good. So I don't advise sending your manuscript to a third party for clearance. You're better off focusing on what you can control, analyzing the risk, and deciding whether you've minimized it as much as possible and what your risk tolerance is. So I would keep it in-house.
Yeah, I can imagine in that scenario with using the seminary, it makes sense to me that does feel like real legal risk to use the name without permission. And if they had said no, do you think it would have been sufficient for them to just change the name of the seminary?
Change the name, change the location, change the description, change the hierarchy of power. You'd have to rewrite that. And you have to be careful when you're using real places in your stories to begin with. More so in fiction. Again, in nonfiction, real events took place in real places. You're going to be able to use that. But in fiction, if you put events in a real place and they're horrible events, that place is going to be very upset. The owners of that place is going to be very upset. So you have to be very careful about using real settings in a fictional context.
Yeah. Well, many of my novels are set in the Philadelphia area, and I went to Penn. And so I was going to use Penn as, the de facto setting of some scenes. And when I was first writing the book, I thought some nefarious things were going to happen at that university. And so I changed it from University of Pennsylvania to William Penn University. I think everybody knows. I'm not fooling anybody. And it turned out that nothing bad really happens there. So I wouldn't have had to have done that, but I would have done it anyway, because sometimes you just want to, like, even if it's not something bad, like if I decide I want to have a student cafeteria in some building where that one doesn't exist, I don't want to be held to the reality of on the ground. And
right. And it doesn't really matter where
it doesn't matter. Yeah.
It's a university with ivy covered walls, right? Or, it's like, it doesn't matter in that sense where it happens. And as creative writers, you can imbue it with all kinds of embellishments, to bring forth your story. You as the writer are inspired by having gone to Penn and having been in those buildings and on that campus. And you can take that feeling and create, the University of William Penn.
Yeah, exactly.
So I wanted to talk about a sort of different topic, which is the idea of fair use. So I know that a lot of people look back on their lives and certain songs, certain music lyrics were very meaningful to them, and they might want to look into incorporating those into their works. What is your advice to people who are thinking about doing that? Don't. You can use the title of the song. You can use the name of the artist. You can describe the feeling that the song gave you, but you cannot use the lyrics. There is no good law on fair use of song lyrics or poems that will protect an author at this time. There are some legal arguments that are out there that suggest it's fair use. But, take a look at it from the perspective of the songwriter or the poet, all right? You've only written a few short lines. And in those few short lines, you have plucked the heartstrings of millions of people. And so those few short lines are the heart and soul of that creative work. Why should anybody be allowed to take the heart and soul of that creative work and put it into their own, to get that feeling in their own work without permission? So if you look at it from the perspective of the songwriter or the poet, it makes sense that you can't take a portion of the song that is the heart and soul of that song and use it in your own work, because it's the heart and soul of that song. It's their creative work. So, and on top of that, there is a licensing structure out there for you to get permission and to pay the licensing fees in order to use those lyrics. So that's my current wisdom on that subject.
Yeah, early on in one of my books, there was a passage from The Sword and the Stone by T.H. White that I was interested in using. And not only did it take a ridiculously long amount of time to track down who owned the copyright to that, because my edition of the book is from like 1953 or something like that. And so, copyright had been passed from one corporation to another. And what was interesting was not only, I had a couple of learnings. One was that I think for someone who was more established than I was at the time, it wouldn't have seemed like a ridiculous amount of money, but it was limited by the number of books. And so it was the kind of thing that, you can use this for this wasn't the number, but let's say 1,000 books. And then if you sell more than 1,000 books, you have to re-up. And I'm like, well, first of all, how do you even track that? I don't want it for the rest of my life having to be adding on. And I did find that they were willing to negotiate. Like the first letter I said, oh, no, thank you. And they said, well, like, what would you want to pay? And I was like, pretty much nothing if I have to be keeping track of how many books this quote shows up in. But yeah, I ended up not using it for that reason.
That is interesting, because I have had a case not with an author, but with a documentary filmmaker who wanted to use a song in the background of his film. And it was a song by Sade. And he basically went and knocked on her door. I mean, he was very persistent. And it was a documentary. And apparently it was a subject that was near and dear to her heart. And she gave permission. So, I mean, it's possible. And I've had other people approach, like the estates of celebrities wanting to use quotes from their journals or from their work, and estates have granted permission. And also song lyrics. Yep, I've had another author who has gone to an estate. They were able to identify who wrote the song, and the estate said, yes, you may use it. So, sometimes it's worthwhile reaching out and asking for permission, bypassing the licensing structure that's in place and going right to the source and saying, this is my project. This is what I'm doing. This is how I'm using it. May I use it? And the answer is yes, you may sometimes with no limitations. It's going to be on a case-by-case basis, right? And you're not going to be permitted to quote lyrics without permission. All right. You're going to need permission. And when you get that, permission takes a very strict form, and it's going to appear on the copyright page. And it's going to say that the quote from, I don't know, whatever song is copyright, songwriter, authorized by, and when you get the license, they're going to tell you exactly the words they want you to put on the copyright page that shows that you have permission. When it comes to quoting larger works, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. Fair use is going to be on a case-by-case basis. And the recent Supreme Court case, the Warhol case, adds this layer of, if the work is available for licensing, if there is an infrastructure out there that allows you to license the work, it's going to be harder to establish fair use. And I think I'd like to just wrap up with one final point about disclaimers. So disclaimers at the front of your book can reduce risk. They can warn the reader about the limits of the truth that you're writing about. So if you are creating the composite bad boss, right? You can talk about that in the disclaimer, all right? And so that they can be very useful when you are changing the details of a memoir. And there are courts out there that give disclaimers a lot of weight. It's not an often litigated point, but disclaimers can help you set the stage for how you're thinking about your story when the reader goes into the story. So that's just the final point I'd like to make.
Great. Well, Kathryn, thank you so much for talking through some of these topics related to minimizing a risk for memoir and other things. And so please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Okay, so please come and visit me at the creativelawcenter.com, where I have a vast amount of resources for creative professionals, for people who are building a business on their creative work. And I talk about copyright, trademark, business building, internet law. I have a membership program there that you can learn about. So please come and visit, and I'll see you when you get there.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Matty.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Kathryn. If you write or read memoir, what strategies do you think are most effective for balancing truth and privacy? I would love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.